Sophie Jenkins knew every hallway of Harvard, but not because she attended classes there. Her father, Robert Jenkins, had worked as a janitor at the prestigious university for over 20 years. Every evening after her high school let out, Sophie would come straight to campus and wait in the staff room, while her dad cleaned the grand lecture halls and mopped the polished marble floors that reflected the light of young minds and old money. She would often sit on the back steps of Sanders Theatre, her textbooks spread out, while students in crisp blazers and designer backpacks streamed past her like she didn't exist. Sometimes she'd listen through the heavy oak doors to catch pieces of heated debates echoing out into the night air, words sharp as blades, ideas tossed like grenades. She soaked it all in, storing away every argument, every rebuttal, every clever turn of phrase. Sophie's mother had died when she was just 8. Since then, it had always been her and her father, scraping by in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. There was no money for fancy tutors or debate camps or shiny extracurriculars. But there was her father's pride and the quiet promise she'd made to herself, that one day she wouldn't just clean up after Harvard's best. She'd stand among them. On the night of the National Debate Championship, Sophie sat hidden behind the heavy velvet curtain of Sanders Theatre. Her dad was buffing the brass door handles outside while inside. The nation's sharpest college debaters sparred under golden lights and watchful judges. Sophie watched their polished shoes tap nervously behind podiums, watched the judges nod or frown at every clever jab and counterattack. When the final round ended, the lead judge, a famous Harvard professor, stepped up to the microphone and boomed, "As tradition, we end the championship with the open mic challenge. Any student brave enough may come forward and speak. Show us you belong on this stage." The audience buzzed, half drunk on energy and half on cheap coffee. No one moved. Then Sophie did. She stepped out from behind the curtain, wearing her father's baggy work jacket over her old thrift store dress. At first, no one realized who she was. When they did, a ripple of confusion spread through the hall. "That's the janitor's kid," someone near the front whispered with a snort. Another laughed under his breath. "What's she gonna do, sweep the stage?" The judge raised an eyebrow, amused but indulgent. Sophie could hear her heart pounding in her ears, but she didn't flinch. She looked past the rows of curious faces and found her father at the back of the hall, standing frozen with his buffing rag in hand, eyes locked on her, his mouth slightly open. She stepped up to the mic. Her hands trembled for half a second, then steadied as she gripped the cold metal stand. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and met the gaze of the professor who looked ready to dismiss her at the first slip of her tongue. She started soft, almost too soft for the rows at the back to hear, but the hush in the hall spread like wildfire. Her voice built, word by word. She spoke about silence, about how some people spent their whole lives cleaning up after the messes of those who never saw them, about how knowledge doesn't live only in textbooks or fancy debate camps, but in the corners of lecture halls where invisible people listen when no one notices them there. At first, a few students stifled giggles behind their palms, but then they leaned in. Sophie's words cracked something open in that hall of polished marble and polished egos. She raised her voice, planted her feet, and delivered her argument with the quiet ferocity of someone who'd waited her whole life for exactly this moment. When she paused for breath, there was no laughter, only the sound of her father's rag hitting the floor as he stood there, eyes wide, as the janitor's daughter silenced Harvard, one word at a time. Sophie didn't stop. Her voice rang out, filling every corner of Sanders Theatre. She painted vivid pictures of her father, sweeping up discarded lecture notes, covered in ideas worth millions. Ideas that made headlines and funded new wings of the university. Yet not one of those ideas would have existed without someone like him keeping the lights on, the floors clean, the doors open. She spoke of invisible hands and hidden labor, of the overlooked wisdom found not only in books, but in the quiet dignity of people who never stood at the podium, yet knew more about life than any debate trophy could teach. She challenged them, these elite students and professors, to listen for once, truly listen, to voices they'd never thought to hear. Somewhere near the front, a student shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In the back, a girl who'd giggled at Sophie moments before now leaned forward, eyes locked on her every word. The lead judge, the same Harvard professor who had smirked at Sophie's approach, no longer looked amused. He watched her now with furrowed brows, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Sophie's father stood at the back, unmoving, his eyes glistening with a pride that shone brighter than the stage lights. He didn't care who was watching him. He only saw his daughter, standing taller than he'd ever seen her stand, giving voice to every thankless hour he'd ever spent polishing the marble floors they all took for granted. Sophie shifted gears, her tone growing sharper, her words now edged with steel. She began to break down the final round's winning argument, point by point. She poked holes in the clever phrasing, flipped the neat logic inside out, exposed the weakness no one else had dared to question. Gasps rose from the front row as the Harvard team's lead debater, moments ago grinning with victory, now sat with his mouth half open, his prepared notes forgotten in his lap. She didn't stop there. She offered a counter-argument so clear, so well-crafted, that one of the judges reached for a pen and started scribbling notes. The lead professor's face twitched, half disbelief, half reluctant respect. He tried to cut in, but Sophie raised her hand slightly, never breaking her flow. To everyone's shock, he went silent. By the time she finished, the entire debate hall was dead quiet. Sophie's breath came in quick pulls, but she didn't waver. She stepped back from the mic, glanced up at the ceiling lights she'd dusted so many times for her dad, then down at the polished floor beneath her worn shoes. For a moment, she wondered if she'd gone too far, if she'd just painted a target on her back. Then someone clapped, just one. Her father, hands red and rough from years of work, smacking together so hard it echoed through the hall. Another clap joined his, then another, and another. Soon the same students who'd laughed at her minutes before were on their feet, their applause rolling through the grand room like a tidal wave. Sophie looked at the professor, whose mouth formed words he couldn't quite say. She gave him a small nod, then turned to see her father making his way down the aisle. He didn't care that every student and judge stared at him, the man with the battered work boots and scuffed hands. He walked straight to his daughter, pulled her into the tightest hug she'd ever felt, and whispered so only she could hear, "You did it, Soph. They can't ignore you now." Outside, the night air wrapped around them as they stepped back into the world beyond Harvard's heavy doors. Sophie's life hadn't changed overnight. There would still be bills and old shoes and early morning shifts, but the walls that had once seemed so tall now held a crack big enough for her voice to slip through. And she knew one thing for certain: they would never forget the janitor's daughter who silenced Harvard's grand debate hall, one word, one truth, and one fearless heart at a time.